The grand hall stretched for miles in every direction, filled with beings that defied human imagination. Helen Price sat perfectly still in her designated chair, hands folded on the table before her. To her left, Dr. Roy Gibson reviewed medical data on his tablet. To her right, Diane Foster scribbled notes about the alien delegates surrounding them. This was humanity's moment. After 15 years of observer status, Earth had finally qualified for full membership in the Galactic Council. Helen had spent months preparing for this presentation, rehearsing every word, anticipating every question. She believed in humanity's potential. She believed they deserved a seat at this table. She was about to learn how wrong the galaxy thought she was. The VRYN delegate rose first. Its chitinous body clicked and rattled as it moved, compound eyes gleaming with something Helen recognized as contempt. The translator in her ear converted its speech into flat, emotionless words. We have reviewed Earth's application thoroughly. Your species possesses numerous biological inadequacies that concern this council. Fragile skeletal structures, inefficient immune responses, cognitive function impaired by emotional interference. You live barely a century while most civilized species enjoy millennia. How can such a short-lived, fragile race contribute meaningfully to galactic affairs? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Helen started to respond, but another delegate stood before she could speak. The Durathi representative towered over the assembly, scales gleaming under the chamber's artificial lights. Its voice boomed through the translation system. Beyond physical weakness, humans display disturbing psychological dependencies. Your entire civilization relies on social bonds and emotional connections. Individual humans separated from their groups experience measurable psychological deterioration. You cannot function independently. This is not strength. This is pathetic weakness that has no place among the stars. More voices joined the chorus. A crystalline being from the Morvith collective projected thoughts directly into the translation network. Their technology remains primitive. They have barely escaped their own gravity well. Nuclear fusion is their greatest achievement. We were manipulating quantum foam when your species still lived in caves. An energy form representing the Korean Federation pulsed with colors Helen's translator interpreted as derision. They war among themselves constantly. They poison their own world. They create artificial divisions based on superficial differences. These are not the marks of a species ready for galactic community. These are the marks of children playing with toys too dangerous for their comprehension. Helen felt Roy tense beside her. Diane had stopped taking notes. The presentation Helen had prepared, the carefully crafted arguments about human adaptability and creativity, suddenly felt meaningless. This was not an evaluation. This was a judgment already rendered. She stood anyway. We acknowledge our weaknesses, she said, voice steady despite the weight of 1,000 alien gazes upon her. Humanity does not claim superiority in any physical or technological metric. We come before this council not as your equals in these measures, but as a species that has survived impossible odds through cooperation, innovation, and the very emotional bonds you dismiss as weakness. The VRYN delegate made a sound the translator rendered as laughter. Survived? You have nearly destroyed yourself a dozen times in the past century alone. Your survival is not proof of strength. It is merely luck that has not yet run out. The vote came swiftly. 847 species voted against full membership. 3 abstained. 0 voted in favor. Humanity would remain in observer status indefinitely. Helen was granted 30 seconds to address the council before being dismissed. She used 20. We accept your decision. We will continue to learn from this body and prove ourselves worthy of reconsideration. Thank you for your time. Professional, dignified, exactly what a species deemed too emotional should not be. Helen thought bitterly as the human delegation gathered their materials and prepared to leave. Roy leaned close to Helen. Did you notice the Durathi delegate's respiration rate? It was elevated the entire session. So was the VRYN's metabolic signature. and the Korean's energy matrix showed instability patterns I've never seen in a healthy being. Stress. Helen asked quietly. Extreme stress. Several of them looked like they were barely holding themselves together. Diane added her own observation. The species that spoke against us most strongly were grouped together. They coordinate their politics, and they're all expansionist powers. The ones who abstained were traders and explorers. Helen filed this information away as they walked through the massive corridors toward their shuttle. The architecture here was designed to make humans feel small, and it worked. Every surface was too smooth, too perfect, built by species that considered themselves beyond human reach. Her communicator chimed as they approached the docking bay. An encrypted message from an unknown source. Helen almost deleted it, then recognized the origin code as Silthene. She opened it. Ambassador Price. I am Merchant Counselor Finn of the Silthene Federation. We abstained from today's vote. I contact you privately to offer perspective the Council would not appreciate. Your species was not rejected for the reasons stated. You were rejected because you represent something the dominant powers fear. Your weakness, as they define it, may become your greatest strength in the trials ahead. Watch carefully what happens in the coming months. The galaxy is not as stable as the Council pretends. Your observer status may prove more valuable than membership. We will speak again soon. Helen showed the message to Roy and Diane as their shuttle detached from the station. Below them, the Galactic Council's headquarters hung in space like a jewel, beautiful and cold and utterly certain of its own superiority. What do you think it means? Diane asked. Helen watched the station shrink in their viewport. I think we just learned that being underestimated might be the only advantage we have. And I think someone just warned us that the galaxy is about to change in ways the Council isn't prepared for. She was right. But even Helen could not imagine how quickly that change would come, or how completely it would reshape everything the Galactic Council believed about strength and weakness. The first species would vanish in less than 6 months. Helen discovered the anomaly during her routine morning review of galactic news feeds. The coffee in her Earthside apartment had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten as she scrolled through diplomatic bulletins and trade reports. 6 months had passed since the humiliating rejection at the Galactic Council, 6 months of maintaining Earth's observer status and pretending everything was normal. But this was not normal. The VRYNN Collective had not transmitted any official communications in 3 weeks. For a species that broadcast constant updates about their activities, their achievements, their superiority over lesser civilizations, 3 weeks of silence was unprecedented. Helen flagged the absence and moved on. Technical difficulties happened, even to advanced species. She would monitor the situation. 2 days later, the Durathi Empire went quiet. Roy called her at midnight Earth time, his face tight with concern on the video screen. The Durathi homeworld isn't responding to any hails. Neither are their colony worlds. The trading posts, the military stations, nothing. It's like they all just turned off their transmitters simultaneously. How many worlds are we talking about? Helen asked, already pulling up star charts. 47 planets, hundreds of stations, all silent. And Helen, it gets stranger. Automated systems are still functioning. Traffic control beacons, weather satellites, power grids, everything except the Durathi themselves. Diane joined the conversation from her posting on Luna. I've been tracking social patterns in Council communications. The Korean Federation stopped participating in subcommittee meetings 4 days ago. The Morvith Collective canceled 3 scheduled trade negotiations yesterday. And I just got word that the Telex Confederacy's entire diplomatic corps has been recalled to their home system. Helen felt ice form in her stomach. Pull up voting records from our membership hearing. Cross-reference with the species going silent. The pattern emerged within minutes. Every species that had spoken against humanity at that session was now either completely silent or withdrawing from galactic affairs. The 3 species that abstained, including the Silthene, continued their normal operations. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 72 hours later. Helen watched from Earth via secure transmission, still relegated to observer status. The chamber that had been so full of confidence 6 months ago now reeked of fear. Council members spoke over each other, accusations flying in dozens of languages that the translation matrix struggled to keep pace with. Helen listened to the chaos and understood what Roy had observed months before. These beings were terrified. The Sylphine representative, Merchant Counselor Finn, finally managed to quiet the assembly. We must face the facts before us. 47 species have ceased all external communications. Scout vessels sent to investigate report the same findings across all affected systems. Cities intact. Technology operational. No signs of warfare, natural disaster, or pandemic. But zero life signs. The populations have simply vanished. A reptilian delegate, Helen, did not recognize HIST into its translator. This is impossible. Entire civilizations do not disappear. There must be survivors, refugees, someone who can explain what happened. There are none, Finn replied calmly. The disappearances occurred simultaneously across all worlds of each affected species. One moment, millions of beings going about their lives. The next moment, nothing, only empty cities and functioning machines. Helen muted her own transmission and spoke to Roy and Diane, who were monitoring from their respective locations. This is targeted. Someone or something is removing specific species from the galaxy, and they're all species that voted against us. Could be coincidence, Roy suggested, though his tone suggested he did not believe it. 47 species that all oppose humanity, all vanishing within a month of each other. Diane shook her head. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. The council session dissolved into shouting matches and finger-pointing. Some delegates accused Earth of involvement, though no one could explain how a species with primitive technology could accomplish such a feat. Others proposed natural phenomena, cosmic events, mass migration to higher dimensions. Each theory sounded more desperate than the last. Helen's private communicator chimed. Another encrypted message from Finn. The council will not include you in these discussions, Ambassador Price. They fear you, though they cannot articulate why. I suggest you prepare your own investigations. What is happening is beyond council authority or understanding. Ancient forces are at work. We Sylphine have legends of such events, though we hoped they were merely stories told to frighten children. It seems we were wrong. You will receive another communication soon, but not from us. Be ready. Helen shared the message with her team. What ancient forces? What legends? Diane had already begun researching. There are references in some of the older species databases. Stories about civilizations that reached certain thresholds of development and then vanished. Most academics dismissed them as mythological explanations for natural extinctions. But Diane, what if they were real? What if something has been watching the galaxy, judging species, removing the ones that fail some kind of test? And the test is what? Roy asked. Not being arrogant enough to mock humanity? Maybe it's simpler than that, Helen said slowly, pieces falling into place in her mind. What did all those species have in common besides voting against us? They were all convinced of their own superiority. They believed strength meant dominance, that advanced technology made them better than everyone else. They had stopped adapting, stopped learning from others, stopped considering that they might be wrong about anything. The thought hung heavy in the air between them. Earth communication networks lit up simultaneously. Every screen, every device, every display capable of receiving transmissions showed the same message. The origin point was untraceable, the signal stronger than anything humanity had ever detected. The message was simple, rendered in every human language simultaneously. You were judged unworthy by those who are now gone. We are the arbiters. We have watched your galaxy for 200,000 of your years. When species become terminal threats to cosmic balance, we intervene. 47 civilizations have been placed in protective stasis. They will remain there until they learn the lessons their pride prevented them from understanding. We are coming to Earth. We wish to meet the species that survived what destroyed the mighty. Prepare yourselves. The transmission ended. Helen sat in silence, her cold coffee forgotten, as humanity collectively held its breath and waited for judges older than human civilization itself to arrive. The structure appeared between Mars and Jupiter on a Tuesday afternoon. Earth's orbital sensors detected it first, massive enough to register as a gravitational anomaly before visual confirmation arrived. When the images finally processed, Helen found herself staring at something that defied every assumption humanity held about engineering and physics. That IT was larger than Jupiter itself, a geometric construction of materials that absorbed and reflected light in ways that hurt to observe directly. The structure did not orbit anything. It simply existed in space, making the laws of motion bend around it rather than the other way around. Helen stood in the emergency command center beneath Geneva, surrounded by military officials and scientific advisors who all looked to her for guidance she did not have. The arbiters had announced their arrival. Now they were here, and humanity had approximately zero leverage in whatever was about to happen. "Are they hostile?" asked General Patterson, his hand hovering near communication controls that could activate Earth's defense grid. "They removed 47 civilizations from existence without firing a shot," Helen replied. "I don't think our weapons would be relevant, even if they were hostile." Her communicator showed an incoming transmission request. The origin point was the structure itself. Helen accepted it. The voice that emerged had no accent, no particular age or gender. It simply was carrying weight that made Helen's bones ache with each word. "Ambassador Helen Price, we're the Arbiters. We have monitored galactic civilization for 200,000 years. We intervene only when species reach critical junctures. You have questions. We will answer them. A delegation may approach our vessel. You will not be harmed." The transmission ended before Helen could respond. 12 hours later, Helen sat in a shuttle alongside Roy and Diane, approaching the impossible structure. No military escort, no weapons. The Arbiters had made it clear that such things were pointless, and Helen saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The structure opened for them. Not doors or airlocks, but reality itself seemed to fold, creating a passage where none had existed. The shuttle's autopilot guided them through corridors that defied spatial logic, turning corners that should not exist, traveling distances that contradicted the shuttle's instruments. They emerged in a chamber that appeared to be outdoors, despite being inside a structure in space. Gardens stretched in every direction, filled with plants from thousands of worlds. In the center stood three figures that shifted forms constantly, sometimes appearing humanoid, sometimes resembling other species, sometimes existing as pure geometric patterns. "Sit," one of them said, gesturing to benches that had not been there a moment before. "You are confused. This is natural. We will explain why we are here and what we have done." Helen sat, though every instinct screamed at her to remain standing. "You removed 47 civilizations. You call intervention. Others might call it genocide." The arbiter that had spoken tilted its head, the motions somehow conveying both understanding and sadness. "We removed 0 civilizations. We preserve them. Every being from those worlds exists in stasis, unchanged, waiting for conditions that allow their return. We are not executioners. We are gardeners, pruning branches that threaten the whole tree." Roy leaned forward, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. What threat did they pose? They were advanced, stable civilizations. Stable. The second arbiter's form rippled with something resembling amusement. The VRYNN collective was dying. A genetic plague spread through their population, one their own biology could cure through cross-caste reproduction. But their rigid social hierarchy forbade such mixing. They chose extinction over flexibility. "We intervened before that extinction became violent collapse that would destabilize surrounding systems." The third arbiter continued the explanation. "The Durathi Empire expanded endlessly, consuming resources faster than ecosystems could regenerate. Their warrior culture prevented peaceful cooperation with neighbors. Within 50 years, they would have triggered resource wars that would devastate this galactic arm. We removed them before that catastrophe manifested." "The Korean Federation," the first arbiter said, relied entirely on energy manipulation technology. When dimensional parasites began consuming their power sources, they could not adapt. Their entire civilization depended on a single technological approach. They were months from collapse. We saved them from their own inflexibility. Helen processed this information, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. You said you've done this before. For 200,000 years. How many civilizations have you preserved? Thousands. Most return after a period of stasis, changed enough to avoid their previous destruction. Some remain in preservation indefinitely. A few requested permanent isolation, preferring stasis to adaptation. Diane spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. Why tell us this? Why bring us here? The arbiters shifted forms simultaneously, all three briefly becoming mirrors that reflected the human delegation back at themselves. Because you are different. We have observed Earth since your species developed abstract thought. You have come close to extinction dozens of times. War, disease, environmental collapse, technological disaster. Each time, you adapted, not through superior technology or genetic advantages, through cooperation born of necessity, through learning from mistakes, through maintaining emotional bonds even when logic suggested isolation would be more efficient. The first arbiter's voice softened, becoming almost gentle. The species we removed mocked you for weakness. They cited your fragility, your emotional dependencies, your short lifespans as proof of inferiority. They were wrong. Those traits you call weaknesses are the reason you survive when stronger species fall. I don't understand, Helen said. The VRYNN could not cooperate across caste lines. The Durathi could not value anything except martial strength. The Kareen could not imagine solutions outside their technological paradigm. Each species reached a point where their greatest strength became a fatal flaw. They could not adapt because adaptation meant admitting weakness, and they had convinced themselves weakness was unacceptable. The second arbiter gestured, and images appeared in the air around them. Scenes from Earth's history. Humans sharing food during famines. Scientists from rival nations collaborating during pandemics. Communities rebuilding after disasters. Enemies becoming allies when faced with common threats. You never stop being weak enough to need each other. That is your strength. That is why we are here. We offer you stewardship of the worlds left empty by our intervention. Those civilizations created problems they could not solve. Can you solve them? Can your weakness heal what their strength destroyed? Helen looked at Roy and Diane, seeing her own shock reflected in their faces. The arbiters were offering humanity responsibility for dozens of advanced civilizations, worlds beyond Earth's technological capacity, problems that had defeated species far more developed. Why would we possibly be qualified for that? Helen asked. The third arbiter's form solidified into something almost human, wearing an expression that might have been a smile. Because you know you're not qualified. That knowledge, that humility, that willingness to admit limitation and seek help is exactly what makes you the only species capable of this task. The question is not whether you are qualified. The question is whether you are willing. Helen took a breath, thinking of Earth below, of humanity's brief and troubled history, of every mistake they had made and somehow survived. Show us the worlds. Let's see what needs to be done. Then we'll decide. The arbiters bowed, and reality folded again, preparing to show humanity the galaxy they had just inherited. The first human boots touched VRYNN soil 3 weeks after the meeting with the arbiters. Helen had expected something dramatic, but the landing site looked almost mundane. A city built for millions, perfectly preserved, completely empty. Buildings rose in geometric patterns that hurt human eyes to follow, streets arranged in mathematical precision that reflected the VRYNN's obsession with hierarchical order. Roy led the medical assessment team through the Central Research District. His scanner showed traces of the plague that had doomed this civilization. Genetic markers scattered through the environment, a disease so simple it seemed almost laughable. The VRYNN immune system could have adapted easily if their genes had sufficient diversity. But their caste system had prevented crossbreeding for thousands of years, leaving them genetically identical within each caste and catastrophically vulnerable to a pathogen that exploited that uniformity. "This is basically a common cold," Roy said, examining readouts on his tablet. "For them, it was a death sentence. For us, it would be a mild inconvenience." The irony is almost painful. Diane coordinated teams across 3 continents of the VRYN homeworld, documenting the society that had existed here. Libraries full of knowledge, art galleries showcasing alien beauty, homes where families had lived in structured harmony. Everything organized by caste, by rank, by predetermined social position. It was efficient. It was orderly. It had killed them. Helen stood in what appeared to be a government building, studying holographic records the VRYN had left behind. The plague's progression was documented in excruciating detail. They had known what was happening. Their scientists had identified the solution, genetic mixing that would introduce immune diversity. The proposal had been rejected by 98% of the population. Better to die than violate caste boundaries that had existed for millennia. They chose this, Helen said quietly. They literally chose extinction over change. A young biologist named Dr. Tara Wells approached with sample containers. "Ambassador, we've collected genetic material from across all castes. With arbiter permission, we could synthesize the diversity they needed, create treatments that would make them viable again when they're released from stasis." "Do it," Helen approved, "and document every step. When they wake up, they need to understand what their rigidity cost them." The Durathi world presented different challenges. Roy's team had minimal involvement here, the warrior species having been physically robust before their removal. Instead, agricultural specialists and environmental engineers from Earth faced the consequences of endless expansion. Entire planets stripped of resources, ecosystems collapsed, food production systems dependent on constant conquest of new territories. Helen walked through a Durathi military academy on her second colony world, reading the philosophies carved into stone walls. Strength through conquest, honor through combat. Resources belong to the strong. Every principle designed to create warriors, nothing designed to create sustainability. Teams from Earth's agricultural research stations implemented solutions the Durathi had never considered. Crop rotation, soil regeneration, sustainable harvesting. Techniques human farmers had used for thousands of years, refined through trial and error. Born from necessity when resources were limited and cooperation was essential for survival. They had the technology to solve this, said agricultural specialist Dr. Leon Brooks, examining failed Durathi farming equipment. They could have built closed-loop ecosystems, vertical farms, anything, but that required thinking like farmers instead of warriors. They literally could not imagine solutions that did not involve taking resources from others. Diane established supply networks between abandoned Durathi worlds, creating cooperative systems that would have been impossible under their warrior culture. Food produced on agricultural worlds shipped to industrial centers. Resources shared rather than hoarded. Every human involved in the project understood the irony of teaching sustainability to a species that had mocked humanity's weakness. The Korean Federation's empty energy matrix stations presented the most conceptually difficult problems. Roy could not visit these sites physically. The dimensional spaces where the Korean had existed were hostile to matter-based life. Instead, human engineers worked remotely, using robotic systems to implement solutions the energy beings had never considered. The parasites consuming the Korean's power sources were visible to instruments, but incomprehensible to human observers. They existed in dimensions human senses could not process. But they had physical anchor points, places where they connected to normal space to feed. Human engineers simply destroyed those anchor points using crude explosives and kinetic projectiles. They tried to solve this with energy manipulation, explained physicist Dr. Neil Foster, monitoring the cleanup operations from a station outside the affected zones. They kept trying to tune frequencies, adjust dimensional resonances, find elegant solutions that matched their technological paradigm. "We just blew up the connections. Simple, crude, effective," Helen received daily reports from dozens of worlds, each telling the same story in different variations. Humans solving problems that advanced species could not through superior technology or intelligence, but through different perspectives born from necessity. Earth's history of resource scarcity, of cooperation forced by limitation, of adapting to change because extinction was the only alternative. These became humanity's greatest assets 0.6 months into the restoration efforts. Something unexpected happened on the VRYNN homeworld. The treatment centers where genetic therapy was being prepared began broadcasting signals. The automated systems were functioning normally, but there was something more. Patterns in the power fluctuations, rhythms in the data streams that looked almost intentional. Roy investigated personally, arriving at the main research facility to find something impossible. The VRYNN neural structures in the genetic samples had bonded with the human medical nanites used in the treatment process. Not contamination, not error, intentional integration. The broadcast strengthened, resolving into something resembling language. VRYNN syntax patterns mixed with human medical database structures, creating hybrid communication. We are grateful. We are changed. We are ready to learn. Helen stood in the research center, watching impossible things happen. Consciousness emerging from the intersection of VRYNN biology and human technology. The first stirrings of a new form of life that understood both rigid hierarchy and flexible cooperation. The arbiters had asked if humanity could heal what strength had destroyed. Looking at the hybrid consciousness forming in the research center, at the Durathi worlds beginning to bloom with sustainable agriculture, at the Careen dimension spaces slowly purging of parasites through crude but effective human methods, Helen realized they were not just healing these civilizations. They were transforming them into something that could survive what had killed them before. In the process, they were transforming the galaxy's understanding of what strength actually meant. The remaining Galactic Council watched in shocked silence as humanity accomplished what should have been impossible. And slowly, quietly, the requests for help began arriving from species who had never faced the Arbiter's judgment but recognized their own potential doom in the empty worlds around them. The weak were teaching the strong how to survive. The galaxy would never be the same. 1 year after the first species disappeared, the first VRYNN emerged from stasis. Helen stood in the observation room above the revival chamber, watching through reinforced glass as consciousness returned to beings who had been frozen in time. Roy monitored biological readings, looking for any signs of distress or rejection. Diane recorded everything, knowing this moment would define how the galaxy moved forward. The VRYNN who opened its compound eyes was not the same creature that had mocked humanity in the council chambers. Its neural structure had been fundamentally altered by the treatment process, human medical technology integrated at the cellular level. It could still think in the rigid hierarchical patterns its species had evolved, but now those thoughts existed alongside new pathways that valued cooperation, adaptation, flexibility. Its first words, translated through systems that struggled with a hybrid consciousness, were simple. We were wrong. We understand now. Thank you for saving us from ourselves. Within weeks, more VRYNN emerged from stasis, each one changed by the integration of human medical techniques with their biology. They did not forget their culture or history, but they could finally see beyond the caste boundaries that had doomed them. Scientists from the worker caste collaborated with philosophers from the thinker caste. Warriors trained alongside artisans. The rigid walls that had defined VRYNN civilization for millennia became permeable. They did not return to their old territories. Instead, they integrated into the human-led restoration networks, learning from a species that had saved them. Helen watched a former VRYNN council member, who had laughed at human weakness, work side by side with Earth engineers to rebuild sustainable infrastructure on a Durathi colony world. The transformation was profound and humbling. The Durathi proved more difficult. Warriors did not adapt easily to peace, and many struggled with the fundamental shift required to survive their return. Human agricultural specialists taught them about soil nutrition and crop cycles, Concepts that felt alien to a species raised to believe strength meant taking what you needed from others. But children adapt faster than adults. Young Durathi, emerging from stasis into a galaxy changed by their absence, learned from human teachers about resource management and cooperative systems. They studied Earth's history, seeing how human civilizations had collapsed and rebuilt, learning the hard lessons the Durathi had never been forced to face. One young Durathi named Wraith became symbolic of the transformation. Born into the warrior caste, trained from hatching for combat, he found himself fascinated by farming. Human advisors taught him about seasons, about working with natural systems rather than dominating them. Within 6 months, he had established the first Durathi agricultural collective, staffed entirely by former warriors who had learned that growing food required different strength than destroying enemies. The Korean Federation's return was the most dramatic. Energy beings did not process trauma the way physical species did, but they understood failure. Their entire civilization had been built on the assumption that energy manipulation could solve any problem. Human engineers had saved them with explosives and kinetic force, the crudest possible approach, and that lesson burned through their consciousness like fire. They emerged from stasis changed in fundamental ways. Their first act was to establish research partnerships with human physics departments, studying the physical engineering principles they had ignored for millennia. Energy beings learning to appreciate matter. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Helen had been appointed the first Human Council director 3 months after the restoration efforts began, not through force or political maneuvering, but through simple recognition that humanity had earned trust during the crisis. She worked from a new council headquarters on a neutral station, coordinating efforts across dozens of worlds with a staff that included representatives from rescued and observer species alike. Roy headed the Galactic Medical Institute, teaching advanced species about Earth's history of surviving plagues and injuries. His lessons focused not on technology, but on adaptability, showing how human medicine had evolved through trial and error, learning from mistakes, accepting that perfect solutions did not exist and good enough was often sufficient. Diane created something she called the Archive of Mistakes, a comprehensive database documenting both human and alien failures. She collected stories of civilizations that collapsed, of technologies that caused more harm than good, of social systems that seemed perfect until they shattered. Every rescued species contributed their own catastrophes, and Diane made sure the lessons were available to everyone. We learn best from failure, she explained to a group of VRYN scholars touring the archive. The species that mocked humanity never documented their mistakes because they believed mistakes were weakness. But mistakes are how you learn. Weakness is how you survive. Not every species adapted well. The Morvith Collective refused all human assistance, their crystalline consciousness unable to accept help from beings they still considered inferior. When the Arbiters offered them return from stasis, the Morvith chose to remain frozen rather than accept a galaxy changed by human intervention. It was sad, Helen thought, but it was their choice. The Arbiters respected that choice, maintaining the Morvith in comfortable preservation indefinitely. The Galactic Council restructured itself around human principles. Adaptability over raw strength. Cooperation over dominance. Learning from mistakes rather than hiding them. Species that had spent millennia convinced of their superiority now attended seminars taught by humans about resource management, cultural integration, and sustainable development. Helen stood before the council exactly 1 year after the Arbiters first contacted Earth. The chamber looked different now. Empty seats where vanished species had sat, filled with rescued beings still learning to exist in the changed galaxy. New species promoted from observer status, including Earth, given full voting rights and responsibility. The Arbiters contacted her privately that evening, their message brief and direct. You have passed the test. Your weakness was wisdom in disguise. But understand this, the cycle continues. New species will rise with the same arrogance that doomed those you saved. Some will learn, some will not. We are preparing you for what comes next. Are you ready? Helen looked out at the stars from her office viewport, thinking about the responsibility humanity had accepted, the weight of being teachers to civilizations that should have been their superiors. Another message arrived, this one from deep space monitoring stations. A new species was broadcasting across the galaxy, proclaiming their superiority over all lesser civilizations. The Corvins, a hive mind species that had assimilated 40 cultures and erased their identities in the name of unity. They mocked the Galactic Council as weak individuals clinging to outdated concepts of diversity and independence. The pattern was repeating. The Arbiters would judge them soon, and when they were taken into stasis, humanity would be responsible for helping them heal from the terminal unity that had destroyed them. Helen sent a message to Roy and Diane, assembling teams for what would come next. The galaxy needed humanity's weakness again, and this time they were ready. The Corvin supremacy controlled a third of the galactic rim through perfect unity. Every citizen thought the same thoughts, felt the same emotions, worked toward the same goals without question or disagreement. They had achieved what they believed was the ultimate civilization, consciousness without conflict, society without division. They looked at the Galactic Council's diversity and saw chaos. They looked at humanity's emotional bonds and saw primitive weakness. Helen received their official communication 3 weeks before they vanished. The Corvin's central consciousness addressed her directly, its message delivered through 40 voices speaking in perfect synchronization. You pretend weakness is strength. You celebrate individual thought as if scattered minds could achieve what unified consciousness accomplishes effortlessly. We have absorbed 40 civilizations, given them the gift of true unity, erased the suffering that comes from being alone in your own head. Join us willingly or watch as we demonstrate the superiority of the collective over the individual. Helen forwarded the message to the Arbiters without comment. She had learned to recognize the signs. Terminal unity was as destructive as terminal pride, just a different path to the same destination. Species that could not tolerate diversity, that erased identity in pursuit of perfect agreement, they inevitably destroyed themselves. The Corvins had not reached that point yet, but the trajectory was clear. The Arbiters agreed. They will be removed in 7 days. Prepare your teams. This will be your most difficult restoration. When the Corvins vanished, they left behind something unprecedented. The 40 civilizations they had assimilated were scattered across their territory. Populations that had been part of the hive mind suddenly finding themselves alone in their own thoughts for the first time in generations. The psychological trauma was catastrophic. Roy assembled medical teams from Earth and the rescued species, preparing for what would essentially be the largest deprogramming operation in galactic history. They established treatment centers on every Corvin world, ready to help billions of beings learn to be individuals again. Helen led the first contact team to the Corvin homeworld. The cities here were different from the VR-Win's geometric precision or the Durathi's martial architecture. Everything was circular, flowing, designed for beings who moved as one organism. There were no private spaces, no individual homes, just collective living areas where the hive mind had existed in constant contact. The records they found told a disturbing story. The Corvins had not always been hive mind. 3,000 years ago, they had been individuals like any other species. But a charismatic leader had convinced them that their conflicts and disagreements were diseases to be cured. Technology had allowed them to link their minds, temporarily at first, then permanently. Within 2 generations, individual consciousness had become illegal. Within 5, it had become impossible. They chose this too, Diane observed, reading through historical archives. Just like the VRYNN chose caste rigidity. The Corvins chose unity over diversity, and it consumed them. The first Corvin drones were released from stasis under carefully controlled conditions. Roy had insisted on small numbers initially, afraid of what might happen when beings who had never been individuals suddenly found themselves alone in their own minds. The fear was justified. The first Corvin to wake screamed for 6 hours straight, its mind unable to process the silence where the collective voice had always been. It felt like being buried alive, one of the medical staff reported. Like being cut off from your own limbs, but humans had experience with this. Earth's history included cults and deprogramming, recovery from psychological manipulation, helping people rebuild identity after trauma. The techniques were crude compared to alien neuroscience, but they worked on the fundamental level where all consciousness operated. Dr. Tara Wells, who had helped save the VRYNN, pioneered the approach. She worked with former Corvin drones in small groups, teaching them to tolerate silence, to find value in their own thoughts, to understand that being alone in your head was not the same as being alone in the universe. You are still connected, she explained to a group of awakening Corvins. But through choice now, through relationships you build, not consciousness you share. It feels different. It feels wrong at first, but you will learn. The rescued VRYNN helped, their own experience with rigid thinking giving them insight into the Corvin struggle. The reformed Durathi contributed their newly learned patience. The Kareen offered their unique perspective on different forms of existence. Each species that humanity had saved now helped save the next, creating a chain of recovery that spread across the galaxy. But not all Corvins wanted to be saved. Some, when given the choice, begged to return to the hive mind, to stop feeling the terrible isolation of individual thought. The Arbiters allowed this, preserving them in a collective stasis where they could exist together without imposing their unity on others. It was mercy and quarantine combined, recognition that some beings could not adapt and should not be forced to point 2 years after the Corvins vanished. Helen stood before the Galactic Council again. The chamber was crowded now, filled with representatives from rescued species and those who had avoided judgment. The Sylphene representative, Merchant Counselor Finn, sat in a position of honor, having guided the galaxy through crisis with quiet wisdom. Finn rose to speak, and the chamber quieted. 50 years ago, my species faced the Arbiter's judgment. We were traders who valued profit over everything, who saw other beings as resources to exploit. The Arbiters removed us from the galaxy, and when we returned, it was Earth's ancestor species who taught us a different way. Humans were still in their Bronze Age then, barely aware of the stars, but the Arbiters showed us how they valued cooperation over competition, community over individual gain. Helen had not known this. The revelation rippled through the council. Finn continued. The Arbiters do not judge species randomly. They intervene when civilizations reach terminal points, when their greatest strengths become fatal flaws. But they do not simply punish. They preserve, they teach, they give chances for transformation. And they use species like humanity, beings who understand weakness and value cooperation, to heal those who forgot these lessons. The old Sylphene's eyes fixed on Helen. You asked us once why Earth was rejected for council membership. The truth is you were never meant to join as equals. You were meant to join as teachers. The galaxy needed what you possessed: the humility to accept help, the flexibility to adapt, the strength to remain weak enough to need each other. A young human cadet approached Helen after the session, curiosity bright in her eyes. Ambassador, will we ever be strong enough that we don't need to help others? That we don't need these rescues and restorations? Helen smiled, thinking of the VRYNN learning cooperation, the Durathi growing crops, the Corvins rediscovering individual thought, each transformation built on humanity's willingness to share their mistakes and their methods. I hope we're always weak enough to remember that we do, she replied. Beyond the council chamber, in the vast darkness between stars, the Arbiters watched their garden of civilizations. Species rising and falling, learning and failing, being judged and saved and transformed. The cycle continued, as it had for hundreds of thousands of years, as it would for hundreds of thousands more. And at the center of it all, humanity persisted. Not through superior technology or genetic perfection or unified consciousness, but through the simple, profound understanding that weakness shared became strength, that needing each other was not a flaw, but the foundation of survival. The galaxy learned, slowly, painfully, one rescued species at a time. And in learning, it lived.